Today is the 18th of April, 2017. I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and we're having a discussion with Dave DeWitt of the Athens News. And this is called Athens Speakout, number 401. The topic is a fifth short review of Bernie Sanders' book called Our Revolution, a Future to Believe in, published by St. Martin's Press, 2016, by an emeritus associate professor is doing this review, Robert Whaley, from Ohio University, Athens, Ohio. And the table of contents of part 2 of Sanders' book lists 10 chapters which demonstrate Senator Sanders' plan to restore economic prosperity for all classes in America. In our last show, called the Fourth Short Review, we discussed in detail Bernie's weakest chapter, called the 7th chapter, The Real Criminal Justice Reform. Today, hopefully, we are going to go beyond that and possibly review chapter 10, The Corporate Media, the Threat to Our Democracy, and the conclusion, which will be this reviewer's last short review. So, in summary, Chapter 7, The Real Criminal Justice Reform, Bernie begins this chapter with the United States today, that the criminal justice system has put more people in jail than any other country on earth. This is Bernie's weakest chapter because he should have discussed United States Constitution, which shows how the criminal law is very complex. The duty of the president is to enforce the congressional laws as they stand, and if there is a controversy about the Bill of Rights, it is up to the Supreme Court to interpret the Bill of Rights. In addition, the federal criminal system is supplemented by 50 state constitutions and 50 state legal codes defining many kinds of crimes. In short, as a Jew, Senator Bernie Sanders has a psychological identity crisis. Jews were considered by the United States Constitution as a religion. Under Soviet law and German Nazi law, a Jew was defined as a foreign nation. Sociology is a weak discipline compared to history or law. In 1848, about that time, anthropology developed beginning in the western United States and in Australia. Anthropologists ask the question, is there any such thing as a pure race? And if there is, how many races are there? 3? Black, white, and yellow? And how does one scientist classify the American Indians, or the Polynesians, or the Micronesians? The ancient Hebrews were defined and divided into 12 tribes, and these tribes, Israelites and Judeans, survived to the times of Jesus and St. Paul. Bernie writes another unclear sentence, lumping together how racism has impacted Irish, Italian, and Jews. Irish Italians are clearly nationalities when they came to the United States. They assimilated into the white melting pot. A little slow, but they assimilated. The Jewish identity problem since 1948 is that some Jews called themselves a religion while others called themselves a cultural group. Probably unconsciously, Senator Sanders has shifted the concept of race for both blacks and Jews. Dave DeWitt and I both agree that the whites have a moral obligation to treat native-born blacks and whites as equal before the law. Jews obtained equality in 1789, 1790 by the First Amendment. Dave and I in this reviewer disagree about the flawed present immigration laws as they now apply to Muslims. Bernie then writes about police department reform. Sociologists and Bernie Sanders overlooked the fact that the FBI, the federal police, and each of the 50 states have an attorney general and many county and city police departments. As a voter, I do not question Vermont's Sanders' experience and conversations with 10 or 15 black victims of police authorities. But as an objective historian, I would demand footnotes in any future edition of his new agenda for 2018 or 2020. Sociologists in 2016 tend to think in new stereotypes, even though scholarly sociologists did a good job in exposing the concepts of race, nationality, and religion in 1948 when I graduated from high school. Bernie then writes a section, which is really a slogan, called "We Must End the War on Drugs." Like the metaphors, Cold War, the war on high prices, the war against the mafia, the war against poverty, few bullets were ever fired in the so-called Cold War. Missing from Bernie's future agenda are some scholarly books on the need to control drug addiction. For example, John C. Burnham wrote a great book, in my opinion, called Bad Habits. There are 6 of them: drinking, smoking, taking drugs, gambling, sexual misbehavior, and swearing in American history. And this was published in New York by NYU Press in 1993. John Burnham links the 6 bad habits, or 6 venial sins, together. Some youth begin with smoking and go to alcohol consumption. Others begin in pool halls and start swearing. Professor Burnham is basically a historian of science, but underneath his science is a moral philosophy derived from the Protestant Puritan values. This book is historically objective account of the 6 bad habits, some of which have harmful medical, criminal, and social consequences. As a social historian, Bad Habits might have been entitled 6 Venial Sins had the book been published in 1960 or before 1960. National prohibition did in fact cut down the rate of alcohol consumption and the rate of disease of alcoholism. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 led by Hollywood and the beverage industry to make expanded profits through advertising, theater, and literature and film. American popular culture glorified the hedonism and the many crimes of organized crime, the mafias, during the speakeasy era. Youth during the New Left generation, which unfortunately expanded to greater heights since the Student Revolution, which broke out in 1962-64. The so-called New Left movement of college students led to a breakdown in 1968 in the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The New Left reinforced serious debate among Democratic senators and governors about escalating or de-escalating the Indo-Chinese wars. Inside the bigger tent of the two factions of the Democrats called themselves the Doves and the Hawks. President Lyndon Johnson, who expanded the American intervention in the Indo-Chinese civil wars in 1964, came to the conclusion that he had to resign in February of 1968. During World War II and the Korean War, social conservative generations consumed very few psychoactive drugs. The positive example of the medical restrictions of popular custom of smoking or on a strictly scientific basis has demonstrated that the declining rate of smoking in the United States has been somewhat successful since 1964. This trend is gradually improved overall health of the American people. Of course, the tobacco companies and the beverage industry use the techniques of subtle propaganda and advertising to increase the sales of tobacco and alcohol. Following the pattern since the 1960s, consumption of psychoactive drugs has created new medical and social dislocations. Sexual misbehavior was well defined from the foundation of Christianity to the end of the 19th century in Europe and America. The gradual decline of organized religion within American society, the federal government and the 50 state governments seem to be fighting a losing battle for social stability against the rise of youthful hedonistic society. Bernie, in Chapter 7, was rightfully condemning drug addiction of opioids and cocaine as real health problems, but he tends to downplay the enforcement of law. Bernie is soft about the consumption of marijuana, and he assumes that marijuana is not very harmful compared to cocaine and opioids. Historian John Burnham is a hard-line former Puritan and does not want to legalize the mildly addictive and hallucinogen marijuana. Bernie assumes that as a student of the New Left in 1968, that the police are too hard about enforcing drug laws against poor blacks. Senator Sanders writes, quote, "The African Americans, the Latinos together comprise 57% of all prisoners in 2014, even though neither of those two groups make up even 1/4 of the U.S. population. These statistics seem to be cherry-picked and overly sympathetic to the blacks convicted of serious crimes by local police." White conservative police officers would pick a different set of cherries. Enforcement of the laws are arbitrary from state to state, from city to city, and county to county. The conservative, mostly white police would choose their own selected statistics showing how blacks convicted of taking drugs were convicted previously for long-term criminal convictions. Burnham and this historian, Robert Whaley, would agree that the long-term prevention of drug addiction in both black and white communities should be a major goal of medical science. Bernie is correct that because of a lack of education, the white police are too hard on enforcing drug laws against poor blacks who then consumed crack cocaine. that this attitude may have helped Bernie in getting votes among the 2015-2016 youth. Youth does not have a lot of petty nitpicking about crack cocaine and marijuana penalties that vary from city to city. Bernie himself, however, is, in his second marriage, rather stable, with 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and now has an old-fashioned, stable family compared to the millennial generation and Generation X. So, my first question to Dave DeWitt of Athens News: do you have any question or comments about my critique of Senator Sanders' loose thinking in Chapter 7 of the Real Criminal Justice Reform?
Well, I'd just like to say that I agree with Senator Sanders that we do need criminal justice reform. Perhaps you'd like to see more concrete proposals than he's put forward in the book. But I do think that we face some challenges with mass incarceration. Our incarceration rates are extraordinarily high. I am disturbed by the trend in many states, especially red states, to privatize the prison industry, because when you do that, you create an incentive to have full capacity of your prisons.
Right.
So these private prison companies put pressure on legislatures and law enforcement to make more arrests, to incarcerate more people so that they can make more money. And I think that's a downward spiral that we have to be aware of. Not everything can be a sector to profiteer off of, and I don't think that the prison industry is an appropriate place for private companies to be coming in and trying to make money. And aside from that, we need to look at things such as, I don't like the mandatory minimums and things like that that take discretion out of the hands of judges. Judges are supposed to be the most neutral party in the courts, and I think when you have minimums and you prevent judges from exercising their discretion, it gives almost all of the discretion to the prosecutors, who have an obvious stake in the outcome. And so I think there should be criminal justice reform in a lot of different respects. I do understand your critique of that chapter, though, in the Senator's book.
Okay. Well, I agree with your conclusion here. I have no disagreement about private prisons, and they are exploitive. And I think you have done an adequate job in emphasizing our agreements. So in the new show, the 5th short review, we are going to try and finish up Chapter 7, the Real Criminal Justice Reform, which continues where we left off in the previous show, the 4th short review. Now, John C. Burnham has published a previous book, How Superstition Won and Science Lost: Popular Science and Popular Health in the United States, published by New Brunswick Rutgers Press in 1987. Matt? Flash? Can you put that on? Matt?
Did he?
He walked out just at the key point.
That's all right. We can come back to that.
Okay. Well, if he comes back, we'll try and put the picture on. And then we have a second picture from this book, which is a picture of how superstition, we need 2 pictures. The picture says, this cartoon shows, soon on this site, a 42nd story occult science building. Witches, alchemists, wizards, warlocks, psychics, exorcists, aphrodisiacs, flying carpets, yoga, numerology, magic carpets, Givandini's voodoo dolls, amulets, and transactions. This cartoon was published in 1985. And this is an introduction to this book on how superstition won and science lost. And I would like to expand on this critique of how science in the laboratory, true science, of Einstein and Darwin, who are true scientists, differ from journalism and TV popularizers of popular health and popular psychology. The 19th century popular health magazines did an adequate job in helping to explain science in educating the American people. But beginning in the 20th century, psychology has kind of expanded beyond its limits. And the new psychologists imply that Christians and Jews and civilizations and Islamic societies and Hindus and all other traditional religions have lost their values by the exploitation of popular psychologists. And looking at chapter 6 and how this book is organized, there are 6 chapters in this book, and they explain the difference between true science and popular science in the 19th century and how they declined, that is, the psychological populace declined in the 20th century. And the title of chapter 6 is called Facts on TV. And there are 4 different distortions done by TV exploiting psychology. And they don't have, that is, the viewers don't have time to digest the evidence of the too many facts. And they haven't got time to check out the serious subject of science. So that there are 4 steps to this weakness of psychologists on TV: diffusion, popularization, and dilution, and trivialization. And I agree that distortion and advertisement is a way that science is really scientism. And it dilutes the real science of psychology and psychiatry. Another overuse of TV is the overuse of the word cultural. Historians very seldom use the word cultural and play down the differences between novelty and popularization. And they dismiss, that is, television dismisses, the detailed research of real scientists, which require books and time to digest. So these are the various weaknesses of how facts become a new superstition. They dramatize the effects of facts and they downplay the overall values behind true moral psychologists. Advertising exploits the popular culture, and the biases are concentrated by broadcasting bits and pieces of popularization. That is, they talk about Iraq in 3 sentences, and then they shift the subject to the Jews in Palestine, then they shift the subject to the war in Afghanistan, and people are overindulged with lots of detail, but no general conclusion. So sensationalism of journalism is the way the facts become a new superstition. A fifth problem is TV journalism. A picture, and a colored picture, exploits the emotions, and the reader who has to read a book hasn't got time to reflect on the real morality behind psychology and psychiatry. And a sixth kind of distortion is the deliberate distortion of the media, of just putting in false science now and then as novels and so forth. And then advertising. The advertisers become part of the so-called news, and people can't tell the difference between commercial advertising and political propaganda. And the American Medical Association, for instance, used to publicize, in order to get money, the problem of the use of the tobacco companies for advertisement. So the advertisement contradicted the content of the journal. So we have a cultural function of advertising, which is part of the new superstition. So there is a decline of the man of science, the real scientist who spoke from research, and an exploitation of the popularized scientism. And we have Einstein and Sigmund Freud as true research scientists who are popularized in order to sell TV shows and get high ratings. So the consequences of this new superstition is the eclipse of the real men of science. And the popularization emphasizes the optimistic attitudes, reassurance to the public. And there is a loss of scientific skepticism. There is little doubt and little room for doubt in TV presentations. So these are the various ways that psychology becomes a new form of superstition. That is the thesis of this book. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, I think,
or objections? Or
when did Professor Burnham write this book?
Well, he wrote it in 1987.
Wow, it's very prescient of him.
That's right.
Because we're seeing this really come into play on a very real level in American politics right now.
Right.
We've heard it all through the election season and afterward. Alternative news, alternative facts, fake news, and we've seen examples of it really in actuality, and we've seen people use that as a cudgel to, especially the administration. If they don't like something on CNN, they call it fake news. But I think that the war on empirical fact, to use our traditional aggressive American parlance, is a real problem, because if somehow you create doubt in the public mind about objective truth, there's really no end to where propaganda can lead a people or a civilization from there. And typically, those things just do not end well. I think one of the great triumphs of Western civilization was the Enlightenment. And I think the Enlightenment values of empirical evidence and scientific method and fact and reality and objective reality are a lot of the reasons why Western civilization grew into the success that it has been, at least as far as standard of living and quality of life, lifespans, health, medicine, our advancements in technology, and everything. And to abandon that because of political fever is an extraordinarily dangerous thing to my mind.
I think that's a wonderful description of what this new book of Bernie Sanders tells us. And the young are seeking quick fun over long-term health. And in conclusion, Bernie Sanders, in his Part 2, Agenda for a New America, could profit from consulting these two books and substantiate his kind of loose statistics with Professor John Burnham's both books. And the two books reinforce one another. Now, Bernie Sanders says, criticizing Bernie Sanders, not only is the war on drugs a metaphor, but Bernie Sanders overstates the case with his subtitle, "We Must End the War on Drugs." Cautious historians like Burnham and this reviewer would put it a little differently. Reformers with Christian and Jewish values would suggest dropping the bold campaign slogan, "We must end, ... Hopefully, the Jews and the Christians would avoid the traps of advertising and propaganda and the perennial Facebook and Twitter, which dumbs down television, which has already dumbed down books. So Bernie has a subsection called Dealing with Mental Health. To this amateur voter, most people would like to have a psychiatrist, psychologist, who might administer successful mental health programs for drug or alcohol addiction, rather than sending the addict to prison. But those health specialists who deal in psychiatry and psychology know from practical experience that mental health programs have an ambiguous statistical record for cures and may not be very much better than Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Drug and alcoholic addicted patient must want to cure himself. The origin of addiction in the first place is not well explained by the patients who are trying to avoid reality of moral and ethical contradictions between religion or philosophy and peer pressure. In conclusion, the sexual misbehavior and drug taking and gambling have all gotten worse throughout American society since Donald J. Trump's successful victory in the polls in November of 2016. Donald Trump became a hardline Puritan about one factor, alcohol consumption, since his older brother died of alcoholism. But campaigning during the 2015-2016 election, Trump exploited sexual misbehavior on the American public opinion polls far beyond the sexual problems of Bill and Hillary Clinton. Trump became a pornographer and bragged in 2015-2000 of how many women he attempted to seduce. Back in the days of Franklin Roosevelt, his family had problems with divorce, but the teachings of Christian religion were then still more powerful at the grassroots political level. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their 5 children made an attempt to keep their sexual problems private. Trump won a majority of the voters among the naive and the young who had been intoxicated with the term sexuality since the 1960s. Both John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Bill and Hillary Clinton were involved in some kind of sexual scandals that the Republican and the Democratic TV pundits exaggerated to make money and tip the polls one way or another. Family values were sneered at by TV in the case of George W. Bush's vice presidential candidate, pick Dan Quayle from Indiana. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota was a Methodist theologian and a PhD historian who failed to unseat Nixon for his possible war crimes in Indochina. In 1972, Nixon won a majority of the Puritan Christian voters, mostly naive, from rural, provincial generations left over from the 1950s, with the theology of the Christian churches were taken more seriously in the Midwest and the South. The urban press, defining and defending free love and sexuality, drug-taking, and the New Left, used the old guilt by association propaganda of Senator Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover to defeat doves like Eugene McCarthy and Senator George McGovern. Both the average Democratic members of Congress defended sexuality more than Republicans because of the excesses of the campus rebellion 1962 to 75. Hedonist playwrights, novelists, artists, and journalists were more in tune with the New Left and the so-called Cultural Revolution than the socially conservative historians and economists, certainly more than natural scientists. American public opinion since the presidency of John F. Kennedy have been confused between the differences between private values and public values. Three great presidents of the United States, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, knew the differences between Christian morality and public opinion. Bernie Sanders has maintained his second marriage since 1988 as a stable relationship. Unfortunately, in attempting to recruit naive youth to vote for him, the senator has too much to say about sexuality and same-sex marriage on the part of millions of youth. The real Bernie Sanders was far more stable as an ethical Jew and a married man who had a loyal second wife and 4 children and 7 grandchildren. Bernie adds the subsection to his chapter called Ending Private Prisons, and you have put your finger on that. We agree 100% that Bernie has a good point in that issue. And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, as part of the movement toward privatization of prisons, the Republican Party are seeking to extend private prisons in order to save money for the taxpayers. This reviewer agrees 100% with Bernie and with my partner Dave DeWitt on this section. Ending the death penalty now opens up a new problem. It is an attractive slogan which takes in many liberals and progressives. Ending the death penalty is consistent with liberal interpretations of Judaism and Christianity on an idealistic level. The death penalty has been ended in all of the civilized members of NATO except in the United States. However, in practice, there is also a tremendous amount of hypocrisy on this issue.
Can I jump in for a moment?
Go ahead.
I just want to comment on some of the things that we've been talking about. I think that, first of all, going back to your point about the New Left in the 60s and sexuality and the opening up of that and stuff, and I think that there was, I think culturally, so America's been a pretty puritanical country from the beginning. Even from the Pilgrims, when they came over, they were
That's
religious
true.
zealots who
That's
were
true. That's
who weren't
true.
able to
That's right.
exert their religious opinions on others, so they came here to
except during the Enlightenment, as you pointed out.
Right. And so I think there was a long history of that, and with the advent of television and stuff, I think that there was an opening of the culture, and that's what we saw in the 60s and 70s with the kind of the new left movement and that stuff. But I think what that turned into by the 80s was a tool for the right.
That's right.
To slam the left on social issues.
Right.
And promote, the family values rhetoric and that type of stuff, while also what I think of as a bigger issue and a larger problem for the country is this also coincided with our militarized state.
That's the number one issue.
America was becoming a very militarized state, and I would just like to say that I think what happens in people's private bedrooms is less important than what happens in the White House Situation Room.
Absolutely.
I think that the war and the military, and speaking on this stuff culturally, it always baffles me how people get very upset in America. I think there still is a pretty puritanical strain, and people get upset about, nudity and sexuality and things like that. But you don't see the same level of critique when it comes to violence, and there is violence everywhere on our televisions, in our video games, on the internet.
That's true.
And I would just like to see some stronger reactions against the rampant violence that we see in our culture, because I think that has a worse impact on our psyches morally.
No doubt, you're right. That's the difference between an 18-year-old and a 30-year-old and a 60-year-old. As you age, you begin to rediscover ethics and morality. The fathers and mothers who have children have an obligation to raise their youth in either a Jewish or Christian family. But when they're 18, they go out into the wide world of crime and sin and fun. Just like the story of Pinocchio. Did you ever see Pinocchio?
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Are you going to smoke? Are you going to drink? Mm-hmm. Are you going to do any of these 6 bad habits?
Yeah.
And how does the little crime lead to bigger and bigger crimes?
Right.
So the Second Amendment, which is the favorite amendment of the Republican Party, is a disaster. We don't need more guns. That's not going to solve our problem.
Yeah, it seems to be a distinctly American
guns are
obsession.
The guns are, yes. That comes from the frontier.
And this tolerance of violence, though, as well. Or the idea of
that came from the frontier.
Yeah.
That came from the frontier. The Swiss, the Swedes, the British, now leave out Russia. Russia's a different problem. But Russia is kind of on the edge of Western civilization. But the heart of Western civilization begins in Holland, England, and spreads east to Germany, and as it goes east into Poland, it gets weaker and weaker. And the Soviet Union and Russia has always been 200 years behind the West. And the big problem in the Soviet Union and in Tsarist Russia is, how do you catch up to the West? Or are there some inherent Slavic, traditional Byzantine values that should compete with the West? And that's a problem of how Russia fits in to the balance of power. That's a long-term problem. And it's a long-term problem in the United States of how to educate youth that a politician, whether he's Washington Lincoln or Donald Trump, has to put 4 different elites together: the military elite, the political elite, the economic elite, and the cultural, religious, traditional, ethical philosophers. And most people, enter the war through the military door. Guns and war is the way many people begin the study of history. Why the Civil War? How did the Protestant Reformation lead to violence? how did the Crusades try and kill the Muslims, you see?
Right.
Now, I entered through the kind of a pacifist door through the values of my mother. My mother put Christian ethics ahead of war because my father had suffered under World War I in the Army and saw the costs of war. But those kids who haven't had fathers who were veterans in Vietnam or veterans in Afghanistan and seen the costs have to begin life over again and have to learn through video games the wrong lessons.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's a significant problem that in America we're becoming so far removed from the consequences of war, and there's been such a long time where war now, the decades of propaganda where war is so thought of as other, thousands of miles away, dropping bombs from the sky.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And it doesn't really hit home. I understand that Europe saw its continent devastated by war twice.
Yes, that's right.
Within, a 40-year time span.
That's right.
And so I think that plays on why they're much more hesitant to use military strategies than the United States, because we haven't seen our cities devastated by war since the 1860s.
True.
And I worry that as generations come along and we become even more removed, that there's going to be that this idea of war from video games is going to become even greater.
Well, that depends on the next election. Will Donald Trump get reelected? Will the Democrats make a recovery in 2016? 2018?
I don't know. We'll have to wait and find out.
That's going to be a nip and tuck game, okay?
But to also just revert back to what we were talking about the death penalty, capital punishment, this is the one that everyone always disagrees with me on, and I've just accepted that. I am anti-death penalty.
So am I, in general.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just don't. I have reasons for that. I understand. I never. Most people never agree with me on that, though. But I'm anti-capital punishment. I don't believe in giving the state that power.
Okay, and I think most liberals would agree with you 100%. However, and I agree with that in 99% of the cases.
Yeah.
However, in practice, there is some hypocrisy on this issue. American Jews from 1942 to the 1980s were quite willing to administer the death penalty on former Nazis from the three great powers occupied Germany, when the three great powers occupied Nazi Germany in 1945. And the American government pressured the West German post-war democratic government to have a statute of limitations that was applied to everyone convicted of war crimes in Nazi Germany in the case of Jewish victims. This reviewer himself generally opposes the death penalty equally, but in the case of Ethel Rosenberg and collaborating with her brother Julius Rosenberg in sending atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, I supported Ethel Rosenberg as a victim of excessive death penalty application. At that time, the overwhelming majority of conservatives, Republicans, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all supported the death penalty for both Rosenbergs during the anti-communist era in the 1950s. Anti-communism as an ideology was crude propaganda. Stalin was a real military threat to Poland in 1945. But the United States was perfectly safe on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in 1969, this reviewer heard of Charles Manson and his 6 slave girls, very young, who murdered a famous actress, Sharon Tate, in cold blood near Hollywood, California. 3 of these girls were convicted of murder, and they may have been a total of 5 girls involved. The entire world was shocked, and this reviewer heard of the news when he was living in Spain in 1970 of this case. Now, TV news was not interested in solving the crime by exploring serious sociological data on the complex causes of crime. Manson was a serious, hardened criminal at age 35 and exploited these naive girls from California. The young girls knew a lot about sexuality, but had little Christian or Jewish morality or ethic rules to regulate sexual behavior. What kind of morality did the parents teach those troubled children? Charles Manson in 1971 was convicted and given life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Manson is still alive, with his famous swastika tattooed on his forehead. This reviewer, Robert Whaley, would have no objection to saving the taxpayers' money and execute the so-called insane Manson for the benefit of society. Large groups of psychiatrists who testify in various criminal trials are very subjective witnesses. Those defendants who have money can get a lawyer who will hire a psychiatrist who will give a light sentence for mentally ill patients that leads to a criminal act. Ordinary people who cannot afford either a lawyer or a psychiatrist might get the death penalty in some state court, particularly in the Deep South. Bernie Sanders ends his section with the helpful comment that Mohandas Gandhi, one of the great religious leaders of the 20th century. Some Christians and Jews say that Gandhi has invented a new religion. And the quote is, "In the end, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, everybody is blind." So Bernie Sanders, in his next popular sociology comment, is called "The Impacts of Institutional and Structural Racism." And that sends us to a new comment. Do you have any final comment about the flexibility of, in some cases, using the death penalty?
I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it in any case.
Oh, we got
I don't
too
believe
much.
in giving the state the power. Now, I understand.
Charles Manson.
Let me clarify that I understand that people do horrible, horrifying, gruesome, terrible things. And the thing that always comes up when you talk about this is, oh, what if somebody did this to your family? And of course,
that's nonsense.
Of course, I would want revenge. It's natural human instinct. But the question to me is, we in a civilized society, the society has to be larger than that.
Well,
the idea of giving the state the power to enact blood vengeance on members of its population is beyond what I'm willing to accept.
Okay, but the question is life imprisonment without parole a harsher penalty than death?
I think it is.
I guess you should say that the state.
I think death can be an easy out, an easy release in some cases.
And lots of people try and commit suicide in jail. So then you get into the question.
There's a Frontline documentary tonight, and we've got to end here. But there's a Frontline documentary tonight on solitary confinement, and watch that and see how torturous it is.
Well, we have to end at this point.
Thank you, Professor.
And we're going to have another show on this.
Okay, we can continue
next
time.
time. Okay, thanks a million for coming.